thank you all for joining us. So before I hand over the mic to Harish, let me just give a quick intro, a couple of lines. So Harish did his engineering from Bangalore, and then he received his MS from University of Texas, Austin. And after that, he worked for a couple of years and then did his MBA at Kellogg School of Business, which, as you all would know, is one of the world's leading business schools. Post Kellogg, he started working in consulting with Boston Consulting Group, again, one of the leading management consulting firms in the world. And he comes with a wealth of experience, both from consulting and industry. And I'm sure you'll really enjoy in terms of the insights that he has to share. So with that quick intro, let me hand over the mic to Harish. And all right, Harish, over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Hari. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you here online. And as Hari mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about my experiences in management consulting, and hopefully, you can all parlay that into a successful career yourself. But one of the things I'd like to add right at the beginning is that it's not. I've found some of the insights I've gained in management consulting to be helpful, not just in my days as a consultant, but subsequently as well. So I've done short stints in venture capital and in product companies and so on, and it's always helpful to know some of these techniques and ways of working, mostly because it's just it just inculcates a bit of efficiency and a bit of hard discipline into you, and I think that stands you in good stead. So let me start with what we're going to talk about today. Right? So I'm going to briefly talk about the career of a management consultant, the career progression, what happens over the days of not just on a single day, but what happens over the course of a career. The second thing I'll talk about is, from my perspective, I've done a lot of recruiting when I was in management consulting, and I'll share some insights on what gets you hired. And finally, as Hari mentioned, we'll walk through a quick problem, so you get a little bit of an insight into what the problem solving technique is and how we do it in management consulting. So let me start with one, right, which is the career of a management consultant. Now, on the top of this slide, which I hope is visible to all of you, you see a career progression, right? So, the reason I have listed this kind of grid like slide is necessarily just a getting into consulting and doing one job for over the course of your career there. So you have an entry level set of responsibilities, and as you progress into the role of what I would call a consultant, which is a couple of years post your graduation, and then you move on to become a manager, and then you move on to become a principal, and then a partner, and then obviously a practice or area head. Right? Now, this the actual terminology in terms of specific titles and roles and all of that might change, but this is largely the structure that most management consulting firms follow. Right? So I have some really good friends who've worked at McKinsey and Bain, and this is largely the structure that all of us would have followed and will continue to follow. Right? Obviously, some geographical variance aside. So and then the boxes on the left that you see, let me talk about what are the responsibilities. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's good to know what the primary responsibilities of each of these levels are, what criteria that you get judged on, right? So you'll notice in each of your careers right now that it's not just you don't get judged on everything you do. You get judged on a couple of really important things, and those tend to be the make or break factors in terms of promotions, in terms of a career advancement, in terms of moving on to the next role, and so on. We'll talk briefly about most important skills and how long it takes. Right. So let me start with entry level, and this is typically depending on which geography you're in. It could be straight out of undergrad, or it could be post your MBA. Right, and again, in some geographies, it's split into two different roles. You have a junior version of it and a senior version of it, and in some, it's just one entry level role. But here you'll spend a lot of your time doing analysis, in Excel, in whatever other tool you'd like to be using. You'll spend a lot of your time doing research, and you'll be spending a lot of your time supporting the rest of the team. Right now, you'll notice that in the next step, which is the what I call the consultant, it's there's analysis there as well. There's a fair bit of problem solving, and there's a fair bit of uh, creating hypotheses on certain issues. The big difference between the entry level and the consultant roles is that in the consultant role, you will be responsible for a slightly larger view of any given problem, right? So a quick example: if you were trying to understand how a sales team works, the consultant would basically have to structure the overall problem, right? So saying how are we going to evaluate how a sales team works, what are the metrics, what are the key hypotheses we want to test, and then methodically work through that problem. Whereas at the entry level, you won't typically, especially at the beginning, you won't quite have the responsibility of taking on that whole problem. You will break down that problem into sub problems, saying, okay, along sales leads, how are all of the salespeople doing? Along one other dimension like geographical spread, how are the salespeople doing, and so on. And then there's a lot of work that happens within that, right? So there's the analysis, there's the research, and all of that, which the entry level person focuses on. The next step is the manager level, which is obviously at that point you're the primary point of contact for this particular project with a client. So client management becomes a big responsibility. Synthesizing all these different work streams that are going on within you becomes a big responsibility. And obviously team management, because you have a team of consultants and entry level associates working for you, right? So uh, I've often been asked what the typical size of a team is, and it's very hard to answer. But let me give you, I'd say, statistically the most common team structure globally, and that is that you would have a team consisting of some combination of entry level associates and consultants, but there'd be about 4 to 5 of them for the team, headed by a manager. And depending on the seniority and the experience of the manager, you might have another principal above that, or the manager would directly be reporting to the partner. Right? And that's typically how a project team is structured. Okay, so I am then moving on from the manager role to the principal role, right? So, and the principal role tends to be, I guess it's actually one of the most challenging roles within the consulting industry, because a manager has a very clear directive, right? So the manager manages the whole project and the delivery of the project, and you have consultants and entry level associates under you. The principal is halfway between a manager and a partner, and typically works on multiple projects, and that's what makes it so hard, because you're thrown in the deep end suddenly, and you have multiple projects to work with. You have multiple teams to work with, completely different timelines, sometimes competing priorities, and then you also have certain responsibilities of business development and selling projects to other people, and growing the business and so on. And at the same time, you now suddenly have the expectation of becoming a topic expert, right? So you start to develop sectoral expertise and start to say, you know what, I'm now functionally a Salesforce effectiveness person, or a marketing person, or a technology development person, or you could be on an industry level and say I'm an oil and gas person, or I'm a technology, media, and telecom person, or something like that, right? So the principal role is actually one of the hardest bridges to make, and once you progress beyond the principal role, then you get promoted to a partner. Typically, that doesn't quite. It's not necessarily a linear progression. The partner thing in most of the top management consulting firms happens by election, and sometimes the timelines vary and so on. But as a partner, again, you're not really looking at at a project level work too much. You probably spend some time on each project trying to contribute intellectually, but mostly you act as a thought partner to the client. And so the client will come to you with a problem, and you kind of have to decode and help them through that. You're you develop deep topic expertise and start to become a renowned authority in that particular topic, and you spend a lot of your time obviously doing sales, developing new business and getting new clients and so on. And then as you progress, you may or may not want to become a practice or an area head. Some people try to stay more administrative, some people become more sales oriented, and that's an optional kind of progression, right? And you'll see at the very bottom I've listed duration, and this is the typical duration. So typically you stay for a couple of years in your entry level, use another couple of years as a consultant, move on and do 2 to 3 years as a manager before doing 3 to 4 years as a principal. That window of principal is probably the broadest because, as I said, until you get elected as partner, sometimes you stay on, sometimes you don't, and then you become a practice or area head. Right? Now, the one thing that you have to remember with career progression is that it's not, the, it's something that a lot of consulting firms talk about. Used to talk about quite proudly, and no longer do because it's no longer a feature that they think is actually admirable. Is there is an up or out system, right? And what does an up or out system mean? It means that typically for at each of these levels you have a set of people, right? So you have you and your cohorts. I mean, basically your cohort, right? So maybe 10 people started at the entry level position in a particular office in a particular role, and now, you know, 8 of them progressed to become consultants. 1 or 2 of them didn't work out either because they weren't delivering to what the company needed them to, or because they wanted to leave and go on and do other things. And of the 8, maybe 5 go on to become managers, again for the same 2 reasons. And of the 5, maybe 2 or 3 become principals, and so on. And so you start to see there is a pyramid structure, right? So for every partner that you see at a firm, typically at a BCG or a McKinsey or a Bain, you'd see about 10 people entering the pipeline, right? So starting off as associates, and that's by design because a lot of people don't actually enter consulting with the intention of staying in consulting. Like myself, I thought that it's a fantastic training ground and a fantastic way to learn some of the skills and move on and do other things. And it's one of the few professions where that's not only anticipated but also encouraged, right? So it's as long as the expectations are mutual, I think that's actually a fantastic arrangement. Let me quickly run through the middle section. What are the criteria you're going to get judged on, right? So the very and what is the most important skill? So at the very early stages, right, all you're focused on is yourself, right? You do fantastic analysis, you get work done, great job, right? Those are your expectations, right? As a consultant, which is typically your post, few years post MBA, and I'm guessing that there are a lot of you who, because of your experience levels, will fall somewhere between the consultant and manager spaces if you were to enter in management consulting. So there it's a little bigger, right? So it's not just about you. You'll start to get some oversight and supervisory responsibility. You'll quite often in certain teams be overseeing an entry level associate or two, but you have to manage up, as they say, and make sure that you're delivering on not just delivering on whatever was asked of you, but also proactively reach out to your manager and make suggestions and make arguments for or against certain issues, and that's what constitutes a happy manager, and that's what you get judged on. And then as you move on as a manager, then it's not just about making sure that your team's doing well, but it's also about your client, who's your primary responsibility, and making sure that they're happy with what you're delivering, and that your partner is sufficiently happy with what you're delivering, not just to the client, but in terms of the intellectual rigor and the degree to which you're managing your team efficiently and so on, right? So for example, if your team's let's say you deliver a fantastic project, and your client is delighted, but you've basically been working your team to the bone and they are exhausted and burnt out and have complained to your superiors and so on and so forth. You might be doing well on your happy client and happy partner, but no, it's not good enough because making sure that you're doing it in a somewhat sustainable way, and that your team is able to handle the workload, and that you're not over promising things, and all of those issues start to become pertinent, right? And so, that's why I said the roles of managers and principals are actually one of the hardest, because you have equal number of layers above and below you, and it becomes really hard to manage. Right? So I'm not going to get into the partner and practice area head kind of roles as much. I know this has taken quite a bit of time, so I'm going to pause here. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. So the question is, for managed post MBA. Post MBA, what roles do you typically get? Now it depends on. So it's a combination of what how much experience you have before, as well as what whether or not you're doing your MBA straight out of college, or whether you're doing it after a couple of years, or whether you're doing it after 4 or 5 years, right? So let me make the assumption that you're doing it after about 4 years of work experience, where you've had some supervisory kind of ability, and then you do an MBA. Typically, you will enter at the consultant level. Now, immediately out of college, or immediately out of if you went and did an MBA right out of college, then you would be at the entry level role. But as I said, again, split among the junior and senior sections, right? So the straight out of college, you would become a junior associate. Straight out of college plus MBA, you would become a senior associate. But if you had a few years of experience and then you do an MBA, then you typically enter the consultant role. Okay, so there is. I'm going to move on. There are a couple of other questions, but I'm hoping you'll get those answered, because they seem pertinent to what will get you hired. So I'm going to move on to that section. So this is a common question as well, right? So what does get you hired into a consulting role, right? Now, in terms of background, I'd say there isn't a disqualifying background. I think pretty much anything that you can prove that you've done analytically helps. Now, analytically could mean you know your classical engineering background. It could be a science background where you have shown some mathematical rigor and some analysis. But quite often, people with economics and commerce backgrounds who have not just gone through the motions, but have shown a little bit of um, rigor in terms of doing some analysis. Now, a lot of this, as I'm saying, is, look, for everyone. You could have been an analytically minded engineer, or you could have just, again, gone through the motions without having proven yourself in that dimension, right? And similarly, you could have done that in commerce, and you could have done that in a host of other areas. So even within that, I think the important thing is to demonstrate that you have shown you have done analysis, that you think in a structured way, that you know how to research and generate data, and you know how to synthesize a set of arguments and present that information, right? Now, typically, when you come in with a slightly different background, right? When you come in from the arts, or when you come in from history or something like that, obviously it becomes a little harder to prove your analytical background, and I won't lie to you that that's always a challenge. I know a number of people who've gone on to have fantastic consulting careers from those backgrounds. But there you do have to distinguish yourself above and beyond just your academic background through independent projects, through little freelancing gigs that you might have done for people, or through progression in whatever career that you've done before trying to get into consulting. Now, the second thing that I think is very important is poise, right? So this is something that's very overlooked. So, are you a concise and easy communicator? That's really important, because you might have the most fantastic ideas, but if you cannot communicate it, and if you cannot communicate it in with a minimum of fuss and with just the right emphasis, that becomes really hard. And the second thing is your attitude when facing a setback. Now, I'm being very specific here, but I've actually quite often seen that this is a defining characteristic of who does well and who does not, right? Now, what do I mean by attitude when facing a setback? Now, quite often you're going to have all of these, these different problems when you're trying to solve a particular case. not just in your interview but in your career. And let's say you have gone down a particular path, and you know it's a dead end. The analysis shows that it's not the right answer and you have to move back, and now you're running out of time. What do you do in that situation, right? Or what do you do when your client is being hostile, and what do you do when you've been working on a particular project, but the client gets transferred? There are all of these different setbacks that you could be facing. And do you just say, oh, that's an excuse for me to to not prove myself? Then that's a poor attitude, right? If you say, yeah, setbacks happen and this is how I'm going to adapt my work plan. If I'm running out of time, how do I throw out the unnecessary things and do the bare minimum of the really necessary things? Or if my client has moved out, how do I rebuild that relationship really quickly with somebody else who can help me with that information? All of those are good attitudes. So that becomes a really differentiating factor, right? And then you have these two things called the airport and the client tests, right? And so that demonstrates your ability within a team. So what is an airport test? Typically, your hiring partner will say, okay, can I sit down? Again, as a consultant, you're going to be traveling quite a bit to your clients. Can I spend an hour with this person and have an intelligent and engaging conversation, right? Will I find their company to be stimulating? And that's kind of a more broad way of saying, is this person personable? Is this person full of ideas? Do they have an opinion on, and do they have a worldview? Or are they just sticking to their one or two things related to work, right? So that breadth of personality is actually quite important. And then the final thing is the client test, which is, and this is probably the most important thing, regardless of what stage you come in and what level of experience you come in with, they're always going to ask, can I reasonably put this person in front of a client? Do I trust this person enough to to engage a client? And if the answer is no, quite often, again, not always, but quite often, that means you're not going to get that job, right? So I've told you what's really important, right? So what's not important, right? This is a huge misconception. A huge misconception about what will get you hired is cracking a case, right? So you have this thing called a case interview, where you're given a problem statement, a very open-ended problem statement, and you have to methodically and systematically walk through a framework and solve that problem. And I've seen, and this is particularly true of people with an engineering background or an IT background, but people focus extraordinarily on trying to crack the case, and that is not what makes or breaks a consulting career. In fact, that's not what gets you hired, because there are no extra points for solving a problem quickly. There are definitely no extra points. In fact, there are negative points for solving a problem in an ad hoc way. So if you cannot communicate what you're doing, right? So the important thing is not just solving the problem, but being able to explain what you're doing as you're doing it. Extroversion is not valued highly. I mean, most people think that you need to be, a bundle of energy and all smiles all the time to be a consultant. No, that's not true. In fact, some of the best consultants I know are introverts. They're very thoughtful, they're methodical. Some of the people, in fact, a study was done that showed that most partners end up being introverts, and that's just it comes from being both systematic and methodical. And so these obviously are partners who've taught themselves to to take on a mold of extroversion when needed, but they're mostly just being all smiles all the time doesn't really help. And finally, being a yes man or woman doesn't help at all. In fact, it's a huge negative. So just doing what you're told is never a good idea in consulting. Always questioning why you're doing something, coming up with better ideas if you have any, challenging status quo. These are all very, very important things, right? A couple of questions have come in, so I'm just going to take those. I hope that's answered your question around what background and what gets you in and so on. There was a question around post MBA, what roles do you get? And I think that was the consultant question I answered. There was a question around a specific background with IT consulting with many years of experience. I hope I've answered your question about what it takes to become a management consultant. Your experience the short answer is your experience typically helps, but it's not going to it's not a numerical exercise, right? So people aren't just going to answer question, I mean, give you a job just because you have a certain amount of experience. It's the skills more than experience, if that makes sense. um, the next question is, what types of industries prefer management consultants? I'm not sure what you mean in terms. I think your answer is, what do you do after management consulting career? And the answer to that is pretty much anything. People go on to work at nonprofits. People go on to public sector. People go on to, you know, work at senior roles in the government. People work, typically, I'd say about a majority of people would leave and go join management teams at larger companies, whether technology or consumer or within their vertical. So, if, for example, they were, in automobile specialist within their consulting careers, they would go on and work for an auto company or something like that. What types of roles are available in healthcare consulting for pharmaceutical graduates with 4+ years experience? Look, I think more broadly, if you looked at it as healthcare is always an important vertical within um, in management consulting as a whole, then yes. So, let's say you came on and did an MBA right after that, then you've standardized your profile, right? So it's not just about having a pharmaceutical background, but the pharmaceutical background is going to make sure that you are the person that they turn to for healthcare projects. Right. So to give you context, I worked in financial technology before I went on to business school and worked in management consulting. So when you're first, obviously the world is your oyster and you can go on and start with pretty much any project. But my first couple of projects ended up being in either finance or technology related things, because those are the two things I had background in. So typically, if you come with a pharmaceutical background or a healthcare background, then that is the kind of projects that you're going to start to get. Now, if your question is around specialty consulting projects, I mean consulting companies, then yeah, then I think that's a completely different question, um, and that's got its own separate hiring track and so on. Right? And then the final question that I see here is, how can I switch a career to consulting or management role having 7+ years in engineering background? I think this is the most common background you're seeing. So hopefully, Arjit, I've answered your question around, how do you transition? I'd say about at least half of the people who transition tend to do that by going on to graduate school and getting an MBA or an equivalent degree, and then there is another half that actually goes into consulting or management role by actually becoming a topic specialist or an area specialist within your engineering or technology background. Right. So if you think about it, why is a consulting company going to hire you? Right. Very broadly, and this probably answers most of your questions. Either they're going to hire you because you've demonstrated an analytical ability and you are a generalist who is really smart and really motivated and can get any job done, or they're going to hire you on in slightly more senior capacities. But when I say slightly more senior capacities, I mean, vice presidents at companies and so on. And there they're going to hire you because of two things. One is your relationships within the industry, so you can open doors from a business development perspective, or they're going to hire you because you have this deep expertise in a particular area that's going to help you become a thought partner to a client, as I was talking about earlier. Right? Okay, so I'm going to pause here and we can take some more questions at the end. But let me quickly walk through this, the methodology that I was telling you about. Right. So this methodology of problem solving in consulting is not just what we do um, in consulting as our jobs, but it's also something that's important um, in the hiring process, right? In doing interviews and getting hired as a consultant. Right? And that approach is called the hypothesis driven approach. Now, the word hypothesis itself, if you look at the definition, it's a supposition or a proposed explanation made on the basis of limited evidence as a starting point for further exploration, or it's a proposition made as a basis for reasoning without any assumption of its truth. Right? I think the most important things here to remember are A, based on limited evidence, and B, without any assumption of its truth. Right? So if you came to me with any general problem, I will always have a hypothesis on what the problem is, or what the solution is. Right now, that doesn't mean that is the answer. Right? That is, I've made that judgment based on very limited evidence, and that doesn't mean it's the truth, but it's something that I'm going to test. Right? So the steps for that are, obviously, you have to look carefully at the problem statement. You have to generate these multiple hypotheses, right? So multiple possible answers about why this might be the case. And for each hypothesis, you determine what data is needed to either prove or disprove this particular hypothesis. And then you go look for that data, right? This is extremely counterintuitive for anybody who comes from a technology or engineering background, as I did, especially if you come from a data driven background, because you can't just parse through data to get the truth. You can't ask for data. So let's say you're going to, somebody gives you a marketing problem. Are you going to go to the marketing department and say, give me all the data you have? That makes no sense, right? What does that even mean? And what is the marketing team going to give you? So you need to have hypotheses that you can explain to them, saying, I think these two things might be the issue. And to verify if these two things are the issue, can you give me this data? Right? And so that is always, so this expectation of always having a working answer is really, really important. Right? So let me give you a case study. So this is the problem, right? So there is an apparel company. So this is, put yourself in the year 2013, right? A large apparel company with significant market share in the mid-priced ready-to-wear clothing segment has noticed that it has declining profit margins. Right? Concerned with this, they called us consultants to identify why this is happening and what they can do to reverse this trend. Now, quite often, this is pretty much all the information you will get. Right? I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, but wait, you haven't told me anything. Like, give me the context. Give me, what you already know, what you already don't. Tell me, give me data. Right? And the answer is, they don't know what data you need. You don't know what data you need, and so it's hard to ask for data. Right? This is pretty much all the information you will get as a problem. In fact, a majority of the projects I've worked on, this is about as much information as you'll get. You'll have this conversation with a client over dinner and they'll tell you this. And suddenly you need to come up with a proposal and you need to come up with a hypothesis. Right? So what is the first step? If you remember the steps that I was telling you about, when you look at such a problem, first thing you do is parse the statement, right? So go through it very methodically and say, what are they really looking for? Right? In this case, profit margin is clearly their main concern. They're established in the market, so they're not a new company. They seem to have a presence already. They want to identify the cause and then reverse the trend. And the year is 2013, so it's not your 2009 crash, or there are no major macroeconomic trends of any such kind, except maybe something to keep in mind is that this is around the time when e-commerce was taking off in terms of apparel sales and so on. Okay? I don't know if it's important. It's just a factor to keep in mind. And so there I've parsed and understood the problem statement. Right? Step 2 is now I need to generate hypotheses. Right? Before I can go and ask for specific data, what do I say? Right? So either one explanation for this is that yes, our profit margins have been declining, but maybe this is an industry-wide trend. Maybe everybody's margins are declining. Like I said, because of e-commerce, it could have been because there's a new entrant into the market or something of that sort. Right? A second hypothesis is, look, we know what profit is. Profit is revenue minus cost. Revenue is price times volume. Right? So either they're selling fewer items, so lower volume, or they're in a price war, so lower price, or their costs have increased. Right? Now, I can sit down and generate hundreds of different hypotheses, but this is a good enough start, right? So this is the information I need. So I'm not just going and asking for random information. I'm telling you this is why I think I need these answers. I mean these points of data, because I think the answer might be one of these things, right? Once you do that, obviously you can figure out what data you want, right? You want data for industry-wide sales revenue and profit margin to identify when the decline started, to see if there's an industry-wide trend. And you need some data on companies' historical information on sales volume, sales price, and cost breakdown. Right? Now remember, all of this is not part of the problem statement. These are all things that you as a consultant have to come up with, right? Because the only information you had was that one single line problem statement saying, hey, our profit margins are declining, tell me why, or go find out why, and then tell me how I can fix it. Now you have to come up with these hypotheses, because you'll then have to go to the head of marketing, and you'll have to go to the head of sales, and you'll then have to go to the head of operations and get their sales volume information, sales price information, their cost breakdown, and all of these things. And then they're going to ask you why. And how are you going to say, why do I need this information? Because you're going to have to explain to them that, hey, your CEO hired us to find out why this is happening. This is what I think has been happening in the industry. These are my hypotheses on what I think are the problems. And for me to either prove or disprove that hypothesis, I need this information. So if you can help me, I can go through it and see if it works. Otherwise, you can't just go and say, hey, head of sales, give me your last 5 years sales information, right? They're going to throw you out of the office. So all of this becomes a very systematic hypothesis driven approach. So then what do you do, right? Then, for example, you might have gone to the head of operations and said, give me your cost information. And they just gave you their cost tables for the last 5 years, at least at the high level. And I'm looking at this table very quickly over the last 5 years and seeing that the third row, which is manufacturing overhead, has increased a little bit, but not significantly over 5 years. That's probably inflation. Distribution costs have not gone up at all, so nothing to worry there. Sales and general and administrative costs haven't gone up, so you haven't paid a lot in overheads. But I see two rows that have gone up significantly: direct labor and raw materials. Right? What does this mean? This means that you're now spending a lot more on procuring raw materials, and you're spending a lot more on paying people to produce your goods. Right? So based on this, now I have a couple of explanations. Right? So one possible explanation is that raw material costs have spiked significantly. Right? Now, why would raw materials costs have gone up significantly? It could be because your product mix. And maybe you've been using more silk, or you've been producing more silk clothes. Maybe you've been producing more clothes that use imported fabric. Right? Maybe you're using clothes that actually are not that simple to produce. So your product mix has become more complicated. Maybe you're actually producing a wider variety of clothing. Right? Um, so all of that is one explanation. Obviously, the more simple explanation is that maybe just the cost of cotton has gone up, but I know for a fact by a quick Google search that that's not the case between 2009 and 2013. The cost of cotton hasn't doubled, so that can't be the explanation, or it could be a factor. And then let's look at the second thing that we saw increasing significantly, right? Cost of direct labor. Why would cost of direct labor have doubled? Right? It's probably doubled because I don't know. Partly maybe because our sales have increased, right? And as sales have increased, we've had to produce more goods, and as we produce more goods, you know what? Maybe we're actually need more labor to produce those goods, right? Now remember, SG&A doesn't have to go up because that's just overhead. That's headquarters, right? But actual direct labor might have to go up. Right? Or maybe because, as I was saying, maybe we're producing more embroidered clothes, maybe we're producing more silk clothes, and all of these require specialty skills, and maybe you end up having to pay a lot more for that. Or a final explanation for that, maybe you're just doing a very poor job of negotiating with workers unions, and maybe they have basically held you to ransom and have forced you to increase their payments. Now, again, none of these are. You probably need another round of trying to figure out if these are the right answers, and another round of data gathering, right? But at least this has narrowed it down from, hey, give me all of your information, to um, these are the initial hypotheses. This is what I see. I don't think it's a distribution or an SG&A cost or manufacturing overhead cost issue. I think it's a raw material and direct labor issue, because these are the things that have gone up in terms of costs. I'd like to understand why these costs have gone up, and here are my few reasons why. And now you would probably go and do a round two of the same hypothesis driven approach. Right? Now, as you can see, this is not the easiest way to think about it. It needs a little bit of industry context. It needs a little bit of understanding background of how problems might be solved. And it requires a lot of creative thinking before you even go and find data. Right? And these are the reasons I said it's a very counterintuitive approach for somebody who comes from a data first approach, because um, that quite often doesn't work in the real world, especially when you're working with clients who are not just going to open up their entire database to you on demand, right? And more importantly, it doesn't help you answer any meaningful question, because you know what, even if you have all of the data, you still need to know where to look. And how do you know where to look? You have a hypothesis, right? So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into how not just consultants solve problems, but also how you would solve such a problem if you were given these questions during your interviews, which inevitably you will be, right? So the case interview that I was describing, this is exactly how you will get asked these questions. I know I've gone way over time, so I apologize to Hari in advance for that, but I'm going to pause here. So I'm pretty much done with everything I wanted to speak. So if there are a couple of final questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I wish you all a wonderful and fruitful career. Hopefully, I'll see some of you at some point and cross paths with some of you. I hope this was helpful, and thank you.